Yeah, that's my beautiful wife. If you didn't know, man, I married. I went for it. I know beauty is fleeting, but I went for it. Um, so that my search then, back when I desired a wife, needed to be for someone whom I thought was striving to honor Christ in all of life, not just in aspects of it, not just fragments of life. All right, but someone whom I thought would honor Christ. I saw they are striving to honor Christ with everything that they had. All right. Uh, so that certainly that's a such definitely that I could only have set out on if I too was someone who was striving to honor Christ in a similar way, and I was not striving only to honor Him in certain aspects of life and not in all of them. It wasn't as though my wife was the best, of course, in regard to godliness. You know, in comparison to the many potentials who surrounded me at the time, I definitely would say there were ladies who were perhaps far better advanced in godliness than she was. But then in choosing her, I was also simply submitting to God's design that even among the godliest of His children, we will not necessarily be drawn to everyone alike. All right? So that, yes, you might all be godly. Yes, the brothers might all be godly. They might all be doing wonderful in their spiritual walk. And yet, some way, somehow, there is a sense in which you're not going to be attracted to everyone, every single one of them in equal measure. So that while godliness is the first of things to consider for sure, compatibility becomes an obvious second. My wife never tries, of course, never tires to labor on the importance of marrying a friend, or at least someone who would grow into one. And I'd never wish it on anyone to marry someone whom they wouldn't just let themselves to be loose around. Uh, do remember that marriage is for delight, all right? Something that we sometimes do not mention enough, but we must keep reminding ourselves that marriage is for delight, and we want to delight in the other person. We saw Adam delighting in Eve. We want to take delight in the other person. And we certainly should not misconstrue delight for jolliness, nor imagine that momentary pleasure is ultimately why we marry, but we would do well to keep from the error of not thinking about delight at all. So, of course, some of you might be taken aback by the fact that I've only mentioned godliness as you're considering who to get married to, and I've only mentioned, you know, that compatibility, that attractiveness that you would have towards this person. And some of you might be wondering, how come you haven't spoken about the purpose, the calling to which I am called? I've been in circles, quite unfortunately, where there was a sense of emphasizing calling that was quite unhealthy. So it's a good thing, yes, to say do find someone who's going to be compatible to kind of how you have been called. But then if you elevate that above godliness, there's a problem. If you start saying, not only are we to care about the fact that, oh, I'm called as a missionary and I desire to go as a missionary, and what I am to look at primarily is also another lady who says exactly the same thing that I am saying, and make that to be the category with which I am going to choose a partner, there's a bit of a problem. And so what happened in this circle that I was a part of was there started to be an emphasis. So, you know, with mission, how we can have a number of things that we can be doing, and there are those who might, only be giving of their resources and sending in that way. There are those who, like me, and what I was doing was basically mostly just working to mobilize the church, get people excited about the mission of God. There would be those as well who choose to go as missionaries, right? And so there was such an emphasis that it became a thing in this circle that actually relationships were breaking if I want to go and you're saying, so I've not even gone as a missionary. It's a desire that I have and something I'm praying over. And you're saying, young lady, you're saying you actually want to stay behind and mobilize the church. So you're not even saying you're going to work at a bank, but you're just saying you're going to stay behind and mobilize the church. And I'm thinking, no, I cannot get married to you on that basis. All right? And that was wrong. The reason why that's wrong, there's so many reasons, but even one of them is just the fact that I would have said, I want to go to Somalia as a missionary. And am I God to know for certain that I will go? Right? I may end up not going. I actually might end up staying behind and mobilizing the church. I might end up staying behind and maybe even taking a job in a bank and working still to the glory of God and honoring Him in that way, right? We know so many people who start off as pastors and end up doing something different, or start off as missionaries out on the field and end up coming back to the church and working as pastors, all right? So that while it is wise to seek someone whose gifts would complement your specific calling and who is drawn to the same thing you're drawn to, it would be unwise to hinge a lifelong commitment, such as marriage, on what might turn out to be a momentary calling. We know we are called entirely to give ourselves to the Lord. But then the specificness of how that works out is sometimes momentary. One moment you may find yourself doing one thing for 5 years, and another you find yourself doing something different. So that I would much rather a partner who is willing to follow wherever in God's vast world He leads and do whatever He pleases, than a partner who can only join me on strictly one thing. All right? Who can only follow me strictly as a missionary if I am going, or who can only stay with me as a mobilizer if I am staying behind. I'd rather someone who's willing to follow God wherever, and not someone who says, I can only follow you in this one particular way. So we've talked about just a bit briefly about how and whom you are supposed to consider if you're getting married. Of course, it's a broad topic. There's so much that we could talk about that, but definitely today we are wanting to dedicate the most of our attention on the topic weddings. And the book we've written, of course, is just one of the handful I did mention at the beginning when we started. And quite obviously, the least attention is paid to what has become a mammoth industry. If you knew how much gets to be spent on weddings annually, it would drive you mad. We're not just talking about the States, where there's all this lavish spending. We're talking even about our country. I think in 2009, Samantha's Bridal were doing a research, and they were saying how there was actually, Kenyans were spending to the tune of 40 billion, I think, 40 billion Kenya shillings. That's in 2009. We are just coming off what is it called? It wasn't quite the depression, the recession, right? The economic recession that hit, all across the world in 2008. And yet in 2009, guys had the guts to spend 40 billion Kenya shillings on weddings. Mazetu wache kulia kina Uhuru anatuibia. We are wasteful, right? Yes, of course, there's a lot that we are losing in corruption money, but also we are wasteful. So there is a strong indication that weddings, as practiced today, prevent more marriages than they initiate. That the way they are approached, the way they are handled, the thing that they have been made to be about, prevent more marriages than they initiate. The associated cumbersomeness makes it seem like two, that is a man and his wife, cannot become one, as the Lord intends for a man and his wife to be one, unless two, that is man and money, have been put asunder. So yes, you're longing to be one with the person whom you desire to marry, and yet still there has to be a putting asunder of man and money. There's something that has to give, right? You have to be thinking about probably planning to budget with, say, 500,000 Kenya shillings that you have to be parting with for the sake of that. Our desire for a simple wedding, however, we did wed quite simply. We had we tried as much to challenge conventions. We thought, must we offer pilau? Maybe not. So we can offer guys tea and snacks. And mwenye ata complain shida yake, must we have our wedding on a Saturday morning at 10 a.m.? Probably not. And we thought, okay, we could actually cut on the cost if we had it on a Friday evening, starting at 4, and guys would be coming from eating lunch, and after hapo watenda wakule supper. So no one is going to tell us that we didn't feed them, right? And there were just so many other things that we were doing to, make it as bearable as possible on us, and even on the people who were supporting us, people who were giving to us. Yet our desire for a simple wedding was not so much with the aim that we'd spend little money. Because again, if that's what it's all about, your wedding still is about money. right? It's still about money, whether you're consumed with spending much on it or you're consumed with spending little, all right? So that there had to be a greater aim, and that for us was to make much of Christ. There had to be something within us pushing us to make much of Christ. And we thought our wedding would glorify God best that way, whether it costs 1 million. If we spend 1 million with the aim to make much of Jesus, or if we spend just 100,000 or even 50,000 with the aim to make much of Jesus, we feel we have succeeded either way. All right. We definitely do consider quite a number of motivations that guys would have in desiring to wed. One of them being that marriage needs witnesses. You think about just the significance of it. If you look at the examples, of course, we delineate quite a number of these things in the book. So not going into them. I mean, it's an entire book that we're going to try to cover in this compressed bit of time. But then you think about the weddings, even in the Bible, there were witnesses. There were witnesses when Ruth and Boaz, came together in marriage, and Boaz would call the townspeople to come and witness him taking Ruth, even as he bought, Naomi's property and all that belonged to her children. There were witnesses when Rebecca was getting married to Isaac. You might think Isaac alisubiri tu home, and then the lady showed up and he took her into his mother's tent, but not quite. There were witnesses. Part of the wedding happened at Rebecca's home, right? I mean, you see, even with the example of the weddings that Jesus, the one that Jesus attends, wherever weddings were mentioned, there was a sense of witnesses, and that's significant to be considering. So there's so many of us who tend to feel as though, do we need them? And sometimes the attitude, even behind the more privatized, invites-only kind of wedding, is not really so much that we don't need necessarily to have every single one who is a friend come to our wedding. That's a truth. That's a reality. And even if you wanted every single one of them to come to your wedding, they might not quite come to your wedding. But yet sometimes it's an attitude of, we do not need these guys. We do not need these friends. And so we're going to close ourselves, and we want this close-knit kind of thing that we would try as much as possible to discourage. If you consider yet again the fact that weddings do have a sense of impact in our view, in our regard of the kingdom of heaven. Think about the fact that even though our earthly weddings are mere symbols, so again, there's a lot of symbolism spoken of, a wedding being a symbol of something far greater. Paul says in Ephesians about marriage, he's talking, comparing marriage with that union between Christ and the church. And we know how weddings are part of why we actually wed is to point the world to, that wedding that is to come. And even though our earthly weddings are mere symbols of that indescribable heavenly wedding that we all anticipate, the symbolism is not just something to be trifled, okay? We may never, for example, say de-escalate conflicts with our weddings as happen in the world, the things that the gospel will ultimately undo, but we can speak of an infinitely greater power that will dispossess hell of people from every tribe, tongue, and nation with them. With our wedding, we can speak, we can pronounce the gospel. When we are coming together, one, man and wife, when we are having this beautiful day. So part of my favorite sermons to hear in weddings have always been when mention is made, not just of this wedding, but actually of the wedding to come, right? That day gets our hearts longing and desiring for that day to come. The joy of the bride gets us to be thinking something about the joy that will be of the saints, okay? The joy that will be when the saints finally see their master in glory. The bride of Christ becomes one with him. And so there are many things, important things even, that a wedding could be about, but this should never distract us from the powerful pointer to eventual salvation for humanity that a wedding does serve us. The sex and holy matrimony are part of the things that will definitely be a motivation for you guys. Perhaps even the biggest motivation for some of you who are single is you just can't wait to have sex, right? You really long. And I know, guys, you're in church. I see your faces looking at me like, please don't say that. and you're acting like you're ashamed of it, but that's the truth, right? You know it deep in your heart that you're longing for sex. You cannot wait to, you know, enjoy intimacy with that other person whom you so love. Give yourself away to them and have them give themselves away to you in such beautiful union without sinning, right? But we'll come back to talking more about sex in the institution of marriage and how the gospel applies to that when we come back to our next class. Think about as well the fact that we do wed for king and country. All right, a nation. I do say that a nation is not first prosperous because of what its people have, but it is prosperous because of who its people are. And moreover, the continuity of a society is of equal importance, if not more, than its present existence. We know that the family is the institution through which God continues our culture and through which God allows for just generations upon generations to continue unfolding, right? So that a wedding is a good thing. If you think about the countless times when judgment was pronounced to Israel, one of the things they were told that was dreadful is you will not hear the sound of bride or groom in Israel. That to know that Israel had plumbed the depths, you would only need to come and try to listen out, and a week and a month and a year, never getting to hear the sound of bride or bridegroom. And that was because then they would be in exile or they would be in war. That God had given them over to judgment. And so there's a sense of prosperity that it had for them if you could hear the sound of bride or bridegroom. And I believe there's still as much for us. And yet Satan is against it. Satan is against marriage. Satan is against family. Satan is against the blessing of raising a godly offspring in the future generations, all right? And here's the thing. He is not only using divorce. Yesterday I was somewhere and someone did ask a question about divorce. And another person in the room later after the session came and actually confessed to me that he's been through a nasty divorce. And yet God was healing him. God was working. So Satan is not using divorce merely to make marriage undesirable to many, to those who are unmarried. Neither is he only relying on the elusive pleasure, all right? The elusive pleasure of homosexuality, what we're seeing with same-sex marriages, to thwart any real longing for a God-honoring marriage. Homosexuality, by the way, brothers and sisters, is not something that is far off from us. The depravity that we see in the West is quick and fast getting into our own country. So Satan is not only using divorce to make marriage undesirable, he's not only distorting desires, even by, say, giving men over to things such as homosexuality, but the other thing that he's doing to defeat God's plan for marriage and God's plan for family and the prosperity of nations and societies is he's actually replacing a godly wedding to marriage, a godly walk into marriage, with a costly one. So that it's no longer that we are so thinking primarily about how do we walk into marriage in a godly way. But the first thing that comes to mind is how much do I need in order to get married? It's becoming a costly affair, and that can defeat God's purpose for marriage and for the things that he intends for us. Part of the things as well that's a motivation is that we wed in celebration of culture. We'll get to talk about that just as well. But then what is this thing that we are calling a wedding? So I had an experience with a friend of mine who, had made a lady pregnant, and of course after a while, after he'd learned this, and he was a wonderful Christian brother. We get to have this actually appear in the book, use their story, of course using it anonymously, and he he wondered, how then do I go about caring for this lady? So she's my girlfriend. I actually do love her, and I want to care for her. I want to honor her, and I want to. Could the sound? I wonder where the sound is coming from. It's a bit distracting. So I want to honor her, but as well, I want, I want to, I want to wed. And there was just this pressure of, I don't know how I'm going to go about this. And so, of course, eventually what they did, met with the relevant people, both from his end and from the lady's end, did whatever needed to be done, and started life together. One of the things, of course, that we had to be careful, even when I was sitting with him over coffee and we were just chatting, was really to ensure the fact that you're marrying this lady is not primarily because she has your child, right? Because if what compels a lady into marriage, say, is need for help with taking care of a baby, her commitment to the man will never outstrip that need. Your commitment to that guy will never go beyond your desire, your longing to have your baby taken care of. And if taking care of the baby is what compels a man into marriage, his commitment will be to the child only and scarcely to the mother. And such an arrangement is not quite marriage. It might be a marriage, but it's going to be a struggling one, right? If you're only thinking about, it's for the kids. Because of the kids should never be the reason why we stay married. We are not to be married only because of the kid. We ask ourselves, what are the things that you would think about when you hear the term wedding? And there's just like an entire list of things that we could state. We could talk about, marasuti, dresses, shoes, limo, church, venue, whatever. I mean, there's just so many things that you would be thinking about, and they are money related. But what really are the things that are essential? What are those things without which it wouldn't be a wedding? And we think scripture lends its weight behind only 3 things, actually. And much of those things that we think are what make a wedding sometimes happen not to actually be. And these 3 things are a partner's consent. Of course, key to them being that she is willing and he is willing, that there's a willing giving of oneself to another. There's an awareness of the cost, the price that they're going to have to pay. It's not an easy cost to pay. It's not a cheap thing to say, I'm trading my independence and I'm betrothing myself to thee. I'm becoming thine and you mine. And we are ceasing to be 2 but 1. Remember the union we were talking about last week. And of course, the third being readiness. And with readiness, it doesn't have to be, guys, it doesn't have to be, I have this much money, so I am ready for marriage. I always say, ladies, prioritize diligence in a brother over his wealth, over what he has. Prioritize diligence. I say, men, prioritize a godly, submissive spirit as what Peter encourages women, wives to have concerning, when he's saying the example of Sarah, who was quiet and submissive to her husband. Prioritize that to beauty. Prioritize that to, she seems like she can get all these things figured out. Not necessarily. So the consent of a partner is one of the essentials, that we cannot have a wedding unless these 2 people are actually longing and giving themselves. Of course, it worked itself out differently in other cultures. Like even back then when guys would be betrothed, maybe say even by their parents, but they were in a sense not opposed to it. It was culture and they had embraced it. And so there was an aspect of willingness nonetheless. Then there's the consent of relatives. Those whom you have grown in their care. Those who've been around you, just as we see with Rebecca and the brother and the father getting to give her over. Just as we see with Boaz and Ruth and Naomi getting to give root, even being the one who initiates things for them. So there's a sense of there has to be those that are giving over, and when you do get married, on that wedding day, you will hear constantly this question: who is the person who's giving away this girl to this man? And who is the person who's giving away this man to this girl? So there's a sense of you are not just an island, you did not just happen into existence, and there has to be those that are giving you over one to another. And then, of course, as we mentioned, relevant witnesses, just as we spoke about. But now, what about those many things that sometimes we think are quite mandatory? Things such as many witnesses. You think it wouldn't be a wedding if it had just 3 people. If it had this bride and groom and maybe 2 friends of theirs who were standing beside them and their parents. And some would think that wouldn't be a wedding. That it must have this fanfare and this many witnesses who come to the event. But if God only found pleasure in a marriage basing on how big the wedding was, he would definitely never have been pleased by the marriage that he entrusted his son, Jesus, to. That the marriage union between Joseph and Mary, it doesn't seem quite as though it was that big of a deal. It doesn't seem as though it might have attracted that many people. All right? So it's not so much about the number of witnesses as the relevance of having witnesses. What about having it in a church? Of course, people have increasingly grown accepting of having a wedding somewhere that's not in church. But then there's still those people who feel you must have it in a church. And of course, at Hope City, we probably do not have like our church grounds yet. So I'd hear people who say, the altar from which you have been receiving your spiritual food, that's the very altar, where you must be standing. Of course, by altar meaning the physical thing, the physical structure and that raised pulpit. And so like this has to be the place from which you must be pronounced man and wife. And making such a huge deal of that. But I don't believe a wedding's location or whoever presides over it has anything to do with making marriage successful. A husband and a wife will still have to abide by God's commands for marriage. No prayer prayed over them. Even if we brought the most powerful man of God to pray over you on your wedding day, as you're getting married, that will not work if you don't give yourself as man and wife to living in faithfulness to the God to whom the prayers have been made. Anyways, there are not as many marriages joined in church, if not more probably, breaking apart, just as those that were never started off in church. It's a sad reality that we see many marriages that were started off in church, right? And also that's because of a wrong understanding of church. Church as the building, as the place where we gather, and church is not so much we, the people of God, being formed into this spiritual temple. There's a hallowing, a sense of exalting the words of men and the calling upon men. And so that pastor, that guy, must be the one who actually officiates my wedding, must be the one who gets us to walk down the aisle. I think if you idolize that in any sense, you will be in for a rude shock. We had our wedding in church, and our conflicts began right at honeymoon. I must always tell that story of how my wife just didn't like ati. Mimi na ninja wangu na come. She wants, there's a way she sat on, she's been taught all this nice etiquette. Mimi nimetoka mtaani, I have none. And so she's disappointed at how I'm sitting over the table and hunching and, like, nakula ni kama a Jew just experiencing Passover. And we had a bit of a tensed moment there, and it was funny, So I mean, you're not spared conflict because of where you had your wedding and who presided over your wedding. The only way that you're going to navigate those conflicts is that you apply yourself, allow the gospel to apply to your life, and you Resign yourself to God, so to speak. How about uh, joined by a priest, or joined by someone who is ordained? Still the same. It's not what really makes a marriage Christian because you're joined by a priest. It's not a Christian marriage necessarily because you had it in church. The world thinks of it in that manner. It is a Christian marriage only because you and your husband or you and your wife are believers submitted to the Lord and walking with His Spirit. Christian marriages, remember, are not peculiar because of an exclusive added privilege. All right? We don't get to have any added privilege. Marriage is universal. There's marriage happening between Muslims, marriage happening between Hindus and all sorts of people. Our marriages are only peculiar because of the greater responsibility we bear by virtue of the much that has been revealed to us. To him whom much is given, much is expected from them. How about the rings? Must we have rings in order for us then, therefore, to be considered married? Watu unaona? It's a reality of life. Watu unaona? And guess what happens watu wakinona? Sometimes the ring is not going to fit. And they remove them. Or some people might actually be washing and they remove them. Or some people can actually be having a reaction to the kind of metal, the material that they have used, and they remove it. And what happens as a result? You don't have a ring. Are you unmarried at that point? We had a story about a couple that would say to these dear friends of ours that they have never, so they pride in the fact that they have never removed their rings. And it's as though if I were to do something with my hands that I'm thinking, oh, it's going to ruin my ring, and I removed it, it's as though I have polluted my marriage. I don't think we want to make that much deal of a ring when we say quite expressly in the vows that I give you this ring as a symbol. As a symbol. It is a symbol of something. It's not the something, right? So that if we do come across a couple that actually has been married without rings, they are married. And they don't have to show us rings in order for us to be convinced that they're actually married. In planning your wedding, do not forget these things. 1, the highest joy, not fun, in a wedding is found in the most of God it reflects. While the faithful trust God's benevolent nature, the faithless go to Him with demands, not requests. He's a good Father who will not withhold any good thing from us. But people, the psalm that talks about He owns cattle on 1,000 hill and whatever is not a psalm that invites us to come and ask everything, expecting to be spoiled. It's actually a psalm that's addressing the sinfulness of Israelites when they are sinning against God and thinking if they brought these sacrifices, they are pleasing Him and appeasing His wrath. So we want to trust that He's a good God who cares for us. And we want to make much of Jesus, as we said at the beginning, as we're considering planning our weddings. A big dream for a wedding, again, people do have dreams for their wedding, especially ladies. Majamaa who come to, wanavaa tu suti and wanna show up. But a big dream for a wedding does not set its sight on lavishness, but rather on those things that are essential to the wedding. It sets its sight on those things that are essential to the wedding. Probably have something to read on that. For example, it envisions sharing the joy of a wedding with witnesses as opposed to leaving them stunned by the lavishness on display. So many, quite sadly, invite people, come see me. It's my day. And I'm going to show off. And I have waited for this day. Waliokudharau siku moja leo ndio watakusalimia kwa heshima, right? That's the attitude with so many people. We don't want that. We are not so much after leaving witnesses stunned, but we are after having them join us in celebrating that joy of us being united in matrimony. Unlike a wishful thought that obsesses with donning an expensive tux or gown tuxedo or gown while walking down the aisle. A big dream simply relishes the joy of walking down the aisle to the lover of one's life. If you're riding in a limo, it's not so much that, oh, I am finally riding in a limo, but it's actually who I'm riding beside, right? The person beside me. Much of these materialistic thoughts about weddings that people have, what they have done, is taking our sights from the things and the people who matter, who are important. And you can easily forget the groom, you can forget the bride for the thing that you're wearing and the thing that you're trying to show off. You as the groom and the bride, definitely you matter more. Love and serve people, don't be after pleasing them. One dear mother who's a friend of mine told us this, that if what we could afford for our wedding guests was strong tea, the black tea and rice, if that was everything we could, by all our means and effort, give them, let's give them that. Let's give them that. Let's give them what we can comfortably afford. Guess what? Because they will come to our wedding, celebrate, and leave. But my wife and I, we come to that day, we get to be joined, and we stay with one another forever. And what happens, how sad it would be if we come to that day determined to please them to the tune of borrowing debt just so that we can make them happy, just so that we can portray a certain image. It would be really sad, quite tragic. So do not be so much given to wanting to please people. As a lady, you will often be told, it's your day. You need to be spoiled, have fun. Guys will say that, right? And sometimes you tend to think, hey, finances, the man's cross to bear. Mimi sijali, right? Me, I just want everything to happen with my day the way I desire it. So me, I don't care about where the money is going to come from. I don't care whether he's going to borrow. Let him give me what I wish. But think about this. If you were to care only about that momentary happiness, and give not a rip about the marriage after, if you're not thinking forward to the marriage, to the fact that you will still have needs even beyond this day, you're one certainly to be most pitied. Why? You have forgotten that even though the burden of provision in marriage lies heavily on the shoulders of the man, the pain of lack, should it ever strike, is something that will be borne by the both of you. All right? Yes, the man is the one who will have to worry about provision. But wacha nikwambie, kama ni kulala njaa mtalala njaa wote. Okay? So that if you're wasteful, not thinking about those future days and what's going to happen after this one day of the wedding, if you do sleep hungry, you're going to sleep hungry, the both of you. And so you want to be careful. Do handle friends and relatives with grace, not as the enemy, even when they are opposed to your wishes. You can concede to some things. You can be gracious. You can cede some ground on some things. Things do not necessarily always have to go the way you wish to. Hold on resolutely, of course, to that which you are persuaded is to the glory of God. But do not hold on to it selfishly. There might be a ton of materialism, of course, surrounding the issue of bride price, which, a sad thing, if you consider this, the depths we've sunk are best displayed when relatives dedicate hours. This happens, right? Whenever we get to have those meetings discussing bride price. And I've been to a number of them. I'm feeling like I've become an expert. Actually, koti inakuanga ya those sessions, it's why I'm actually using it today. So the depth of materialism surrounding weddings and marriage is actually usually on display during those events. You do notice how relatives can dedicate hours to discuss with the future son-in-law's representatives how much they ought to be compensated for their girl, and only minutes getting to know that future son-in-law. Right? It's as though, hey, we just care about what you're going to leave us with. And fathers, many of them, give their daughters to men whom they don't even know. And their daughter may be blinded by love, as is often the case when we see people get into marriage and then men turn abusive, and you're wondering what happened. Yes, their daughter would have been blinded by love, but the parents' judgment, which should remain as clear as day, was also unfortunately blinded by possessions. That they did not care, who is this that's marrying our girl? Some of the most heartwarming examples have been just of friends who they went to their fathers-in-law and they were like, I only bring what you can. Please don't strain. I'm not going to put a figure to it and tell you must bring this much. Whatever you can afford, young man. There's a guy as well who, the father-in-law, alisubiri wase wakakam for the, rorashu. They brought the money, gave it to him, and then before all of them, he calls his daughter and the future son-in-law aside and he tells them, take this. All that was given to him, he says, you take this. Because I know, I have made my life, but I know you guys are only starting out your life. So this was a father who understands, this was a father who's gracious. Of course, wanaume say me, it's going to happen to all of you guys, sorry. But then if it costs a man nothing to gain a wife, so part of why I appreciate the whole bride price and the hustle that we tend to sometimes go through before we can get that lady, I think, and of course that cost does not necessarily have to be expressed in bride price, but if it takes you nothing, if it costs nothing to gain a wife, you might never fully appreciate her worth. Of course, it's not like we primarily appreciate her worth dependent on what we gave up to get her. We appreciate their worth basing on what Christ says of them, right? Made in the image of God, redeemed by his blood. She's worthy, period, right? And if a man gives away his daughter to another at a price, chances are he never valued her as his own flesh and blood. You just sold her for a trifle. Even if that trifle is 1 million, she was only worth but 1 million and not much more. With regards to funds for the wedding, guys, it's okay to ask. People giving to you is them actually becoming a part of you, them becoming a part of your day, so that there's sometimes the tendency to, I do not want to bother guys. I don't think that's right. I think we want to also, asking is a humbling thing, and it's a good thing. It reminds us of our dependence one upon another, so it's okay to ask. But do please ask to a justified cause. Usikuje kunitisha do uambie treasurer wako anieke pressure only because you want to ride in a limousine. Is that justified? It's not. Ask to a justified cause. Ask for more than money. Guys can serve you in much more ways than just giving money to your wedding. Guys can give of their resources. Guys can give of their abilities and the different things they can do. People here can bake a cake for you without having to charge you as much as someone else would. And ask to more than a wedding. It's okay to trust God for 1M provision, even though you know your wedding is only going to cost 200,000. Of course, don't hide the details of how much you intend to spend, because you understand that there is life beyond the wedding, and we would be planning for the future. But be gentle in your ask as well. Do not have some MC at an event pressurizing guys. Be gentle. So while weddings have become a multi-million-dollar industry, especially because of service provision, Christ does exemplify for us what true service provision is when you consider that he went to this wedding in Cana of Galilee, gave the best wine ever tasted, right? And yet at no cost. He did not necessarily require anything of them. Of course, a wedding is far from the main point of that text. He's showing his disciples his glory. It says after that they saw this and they believed in him, indeed, as he was the Son of God. So there's a greater point in that text, but then there's a bit that we can glean from it with regard to how he gave himself, offered the best without charging. And the heart of true service provision is that you would serve and not so much charge. Yes, not that you would run your business to the ground, never taking any money, but not necessarily that you ought to be again hefty and extorting from God's people. So you want to be gracious. The reality of marriage life, I think this is why we need to be prudent even with how we spend, how we think about wedding spending. Because the reality of marriage life, after saying I do, should no doubt make us better, prudent with our resources when planning a wedding. But even more, the reality of life after physical death should make us more sacrificial with those very resources. Christians, we are told, store your treasures in heaven, where no thief nor moth can steal nor destroy, right? Christians, we have a command that we gladly bear: go make disciples of all nations. The commission laid upon us is that we would live our lives for the praise of God among all peoples. And even our wedding is no exempt to that. That people will die not having heard the gospel. That some will die because of hunger all across the world should make us sacrificial with our resources. That even if I had the money and I could spend it however much I please, we should definitely think about using it well, stewarding it well, and using it for the glory of God. Surely the needs others could die, both physically and spiritually, if not met, must be worth sacrificing once we can be happily married without having to fulfill. There's so many things we stress on fulfilling, and they are just ones that we can go without fulfilling and still remain happily married. Here's what I write in conclusion, and I would say to you as well in conclusion. That a lateral view, if you think of a wedding only as between laterally and not so much vertically, will make you see things, the choice as being only between you and culture, or you and your relatives, or you and glamour, or even you and these thoughts that I have shared. But if you look upward, you will realize rather gladly that the choice is between everything and everyone else, your desires included, and the Lord. You think about when they had gotten just on the cusp of the land of the promise, and Joshua sees a man who'd drawn his sword from its sheath. And he asks him, "Are you for us?" And the response of the man was not, "I am for you, nor I am against you." It was neither, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have come. And we are not to go to God asking if you are for us. We are to ask ourselves, God, am I actually for you? Am I living in reverence to you? Am I pursuing to glorify you? With the way that I will wed, with whatever it is that I will do. If there is any question, we can probably only take one or two because of time so that we can break and quickly come back to our service. If there is any, you could ask quite quickly. If there is none, we'll be happy to call it an afternoon. Satisfied? I assume there isn't any. Thank you for lending me your ears. Next week, we're going to be examining intimacy and the gospel. Sexual intimacy, to be precise. Of course, there's many layers to intimacy, but especially sexual intimacy and what the gospel says concerning that, even as we prepare, as we look forward to marriage, and even for those who are already married, as we labor to show forth Christ to one another as husband and wife, and even to do so to the world. Also, I have these names here. So we figured today we probably would want to gift a number of you with copies of this book that I was referring from. And so we took 10 names of those who were first to appear. So if you just hear your name, kindly after the service, do come up to me and get your copy. We have Marcy Wanyonyi, Jackson Kanyoro. Kanyoro just would never miss. Man, brother, you better get married soon. Kennedy Munene, Elizabeth Mudhoni, Octavius Kamau, Joshua Wairua, Jacqueline Chacha, Alex Kagwe, Miriam Kaunda, Marcy Kiari. Thank you guys for being the first 10 to show up, and thank you all for coming. We look forward again to seeing you next week. Let me pray. Our Savior, we are grateful that you would allow us to consider how best we can glorify you with something that's sometimes not given much thought, a wedding. We thank you, God, that there is not a square inch of our lives that you do not claim mine. And that's a good thing for us, that you exert your sovereign rule over our lives in this way. For indeed heaven will be that we submit to you unrestrained by sin. And we pray, God, that we would do so even now. We pray for the help of the Spirit to live out the truths of the gospel in all of life. We pray, God, for our hearts to be guided well, those that are seeking, even with concerns, whom to get married to. That, Lord, you would allow for all these efforts and labors that we make every CBTS to result, Lord, in a people first who choose to honor you, to walk in faithfulness before you, and to result in marriages that best glorify you. We praise your name.